Okay, so next we have to talk about a premise, and a premise is a kind of sentence. What other kinds of sentences are there? There are prayers, like you give a prayer, ask the Lord to do something for you. That's a prayer, or a command. You command someone to do something for you. Go get this, go get that. That's a prayer. And then there's the second type of sentence is a poem where you write, or express trees or whispery winds or something like this. A poem is a sentence poetic sentence means that you leave it open for interpretation. You don't really define it clearly or mean it to be clearly defined as true or false. And then third is a premise, which is, for example, birds are pretty. And a premise is a kind of sentence that's meant to be true or false. It's intended by whoever is communicating it to be true or false. The parts of a premise are the first term, which is called the subject, and the second term, which is asserted of the subject, called, or denied of the subject, called the predicate. So the predicate is asserted or denied of the subject. There are two terms to make up a simple premise. The reason for that is that the human mind can only compare two terms at one time. You can only add two numbers at one time. The mind can only add two numbers at one time. The mind can only compare two terms at one time. So that is a premise, and it's a simple premise. A compound premise is one that has, for example, more than one subject in one sentence. Say birds and lizards are pretty. Or you say birds are pretty and ridiculous, or or whether it's whether the compounded premise, the simple premises that make up the compound premise, are true or false doesn't matter. In fact, it's a good way to confuse people. Is you put more than one term in the predicate, or you put more than one term in the subject, and then they'll group those up as being one term. So the simple premise is the one that has one term for the subject and one term for the predicate, and that's really the only kind of sentence that reasoning is concerned with, because that's the only kind of sentence that the mind can work with. Mind can only work with two terms at one time. So this is an example of the premise. Has a subject, has a predicate. It also has a verb. What does that mean? The verb is the part of the premise that conveys the notion of time when this is taking place. That can be, it's not a word. It could be in the subject or the predicate, or in the subject. The verb can be distributed in a lot of different ways, especially in American English. There are lots of ways the notion of time is conveyed, and all of that is the verb of the premise. So there's the subject, the predicate, and the verb.